A princess born into a world of luxury, privilege, and admiration had always believed her life would be filled with grand balls, lavish gowns, and the unwavering loyalty of those around her. She had never once imagined that the very people she trusted would one day conspire against her, ripping her from the life she knew and casting her into the darkest depths of existence. Betrayal came like a silent dagger, slicing through the illusion of safety she had lived in since birth. One moment, she was the beloved daughter of the king, the jewel of the kingdom, and the next, she was accused of crimes she did not commit, her name slandered, her title stripped away, and her fate sealed within the unforgiving walls of a prison. The cold iron bars of the dungeon were a cruel contrast to the silk and gold that once surrounded her. The air was thick with despair, the stench of hopelessness clinging to the walls like a relentless shadow. She had never known hunger, but now her stomach ached with an emptiness she could not satisfy. She had never known what it meant to fear for her life, but now every passing glance from the hardened criminals around her sent shivers down her spine. She had never known how fragile power truly was until it was ripped from her grasp, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. The first days in prison were the hardest. She clung to the belief that someone would come for her, that the king would realize his mistake, that justice would prevail. But days turned into weeks, and the realization settled upon her like a heavy stone: no one was coming. She was alone. The princess who had once been adored by an entire kingdom had been forgotten, discarded like a pawn in a cruel game of power and deceit. Weakness had no place in a world ruled by survival. The other inmates saw her as nothing more than a delicate creature unfit for the brutality of prison life. They mocked her, tested her, and pushed her to her limits, waiting for her to break. But something inside her refused to shatter. The fire that once burned for royal duty and honor now ignited for something else: revenge, survival, power. If she could not be a princess, she would become something far greater. The transformation was not immediate. She endured beatings, humiliation, and suffering beyond anything she had imagined. But through every trial, she learned. She studied the prison's hierarchy, observed those who held power, and understood that brute strength alone would not keep her alive. She needed allies, influence, and a reputation that struck fear into the hearts of those who had once underestimated her. The first step to power was gaining respect, and respect in prison was earned through dominance. She trained her body, pushing past pain and exhaustion until she could stand toe-to-toe with the strongest inmates. She learned to fight not with the elegance of a noble swordsman, but with the raw, ruthless efficiency of a survivor. Every lesson she had once been taught about civility and grace was discarded. In their place, she embraced cunning, strategy, and the art of manipulation. Her rise through the ranks was slow but undeniable. She began forming alliances, not out of trust, but out of necessity. She understood that power was not taken alone, it was built piece by piece, deal by deal. She offered protection to the weak in exchange for loyalty, used her wit to outmaneuver those who sought to bring her down, and proved time and time again that she was no longer the pampered princess they once believed her to be. Fear became her weapon, respect her shield. She walked through the prison halls with the confidence of a ruler, no longer flinching at the threats that once made her tremble. The same people who had once mocked her now whispered her name with both reverence and caution. She had built an empire within the very walls meant to break her. She had become more than a prisoner. She had become a queen in her own right, ruling not with a crown, but with unwavering strength and an unrelenting will. The ones who had betrayed her believed they had buried her beneath the weight of injustice, but they had only forged something far more dangerous. She was no longer the naive girl who once believed in fairy tales and happy endings. She had embraced the darkness, honed her pain into a blade, and turned her suffering into power. And when the day came that she finally stepped beyond those prison walls, she did not return as the princess who had been cast aside. She returned as something far greater, a force unstoppable, a ruler reborn in fire and vengeance. The kingdom that had once betrayed her would soon know the true meaning of fear. She had been a princess, but now she was something far more dangerous. She had become a queen of shadows, a ruler forged in prison, and she would reclaim everything that had been taken from her, no matter the cost. The cold, damp prison walls were a harsh reminder of how far she had fallen. Once wrapped in silk and adorned with jewels, she now wore the rough, tattered rags of a prisoner. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, iron, and despair. The princess, who had once been served on golden platters, now stood among criminals hardened by life's merciless grip. Stripped of luxury and privilege, she faced the unthinkable, a world where survival was not guaranteed and respect was earned through strength, not birthright. At first, she had resisted. The delicate hands that once held a scepter were now bruised and bloodied from days spent in darkness. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, a sensation she had never known before. She had grown up believing that power came from titles, from lineage, from the weight of a crown. But in prison, none of that mattered. The only law that ruled was strength, and she had none. The other inmates saw her as weak, a pampered girl who did not belong. They mocked her, stole what little she had, and waited for her to break. And she almost did. There were nights she curled up on the cold stone floor, whispering prayers to gods who did not answer, longing for the warmth of her royal chambers, for the softness of her bed. But each morning, as the prison doors slammed open and another day of torment began, she realized that no one was coming to save her. If she wanted to survive, she had to change. She watched the strongest prisoners closely, those who commanded respect with a single glance. She studied the way they moved, the way they fought, the way they manipulated their surroundings. She listened to their conversations, learned their histories, their weaknesses, their grudges. She knew that brute strength alone would not be enough. Strategy was key, and she had been trained in the art of war by the finest minds in the kingdom. Now, those lessons would serve a different purpose. The first time she fought back, it was out of pure instinct. A towering brute had cornered her, intent on taking what little food she had. He had expected her to cower, to submit. But something inside her snapped. She struck fast, using speed and precision rather than force. The element of surprise worked in her favor. Though she did not win the fight, she did something more important: she proved she was not weak. From that moment on, she trained relentlessly. When the guards weren't watching, she strengthened her body, forced herself past exhaustion, ignored the pain. She endured beatings without flinching, refused to show fear, refused to be broken. She found allies among those who had also suffered, building a small but loyal circle of prisoners who saw her not as a fragile princess, but as a warrior in the making. Slowly, respect replaced mockery. Those who once doubted her began to take notice. She had proven herself, not just in fights, but in strategy. She learned how to navigate the power struggles within the prison, how to manipulate situations to her advantage. She turned enemies against each other, played on rivalries, and ensured that every move she made solidified her position. What had once been a place of despair became her training ground. She was no longer the girl who had been thrown into a cage. She was a survivor, stronger than she had ever been before. The princess who had once been sheltered and protected had become a warrior, ready to reclaim what was rightfully hers. And when the time came, when the opportunity to escape presented itself, she would not just leave as a free woman, she would leave as a force to be reckoned with. The moment she realized that brute strength alone would not be enough to survive, she began to see the prison for what it truly was: a kingdom of its own, ruled not by law, but by power. The guards, the inmates, the secret exchanges of goods and favors, everything operated within an unspoken hierarchy, just like the palace she had once called home. The only difference was that here, the powerful did not wear crowns, they ruled through fear, manipulation, and control. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to win, she had to stop being a victim. She had to become something greater. At first, she played the role expected of her, the weak, helpless former princess, lost in a world of criminals. She allowed the guards to underestimate her, allowed the other prisoners to believe she was still fragile, still desperate. But behind her quiet demeanor, she listened. She observed. She took note of which guards could be bribed, which ones took pleasure in tormenting the prisoners, which ones had weaknesses she could exploit. She studied the inmates, learning who held the most influence, who controlled the flow of contraband, who had the ear of the warden. The underground system inside the prison was built on trade, food, weapons, protection, information. Everything had a price. She had nothing to offer at first, but she knew the power of secrets. She began gathering information, eavesdropping on whispered conversations, paying attention to the exchanges between guards and inmates. With time, she learned which prisoners had connections to the outside world, which guards were stealing from the warden, which alliances were on the verge of collapse. Her first act of power was small, almost unnoticeable. She orchestrated a conflict between two rival factions, carefully planting rumors that led to an all-out fight in the prison yard. While the guards struggled to control the chaos, she secured a deal with a smuggler, ensuring that she would have access to supplies others could only dream of. It was a test of her wit, her ability to manipulate, her capacity to shift the balance of power without ever lifting a weapon. It worked. Word of her influence spread. Prisoners who once ignored her now sought her counsel, guards who once looked down on her began to tread carefully. She used favors to build her empire, offering protection to the weak in exchange for loyalty, feeding the greed of corrupt officials to keep them in her pocket. She never acted recklessly, never exposed her true intentions. Every move was calculated, every decision made with the precision of a queen plotting her return to the throne. Soon, she no longer needed to fight to be feared. Her name alone commanded respect. She controlled the flow of contraband, dictated the alliances within the prison walls, and ensured that those who opposed her regretted it. She had turned the very system meant to break her into her greatest weapon. The guards who once saw her as nothing more than a fallen princess now realized their mistake too late. She had outplayed them, outmaneuvered them, and when the time came for her to make her move, they were powerless to stop her. She was no longer a prisoner. She was the ruler of the shadows, the queen of an empire built in the darkness, and she would not rest until she had taken back everything that was stolen from her. At first, she had no one. Betrayed by those she once trusted, abandoned by the world she once knew, and thrown into a place where strength meant survival, she had to navigate the darkness alone. The princess, now stripped of her title, found herself among criminals hardened by life's cruelties. They saw her as weak, a relic of a world that had no place within the prison walls. She was just another victim, another pawn in a brutal system where alliances were fleeting, and trust was a fool's mistake. But she had no intention of remaining powerless. She learned quickly that brute strength alone would not keep her alive. Every inmate had their own battles, their own grudges, their own reasons for being locked away. Some were ruthless, beyond redemption, but others were merely survivors of an unjust world. She watched, listened, and understood that even in a place as lawless as this, there were those who longed for something more: order, fairness, a sense of purpose. Her first ally was the least expected, a notorious thief who had spent years conning nobles, including members of her own royal court. He had mocked her at first, taunting her with stories of how easily he had deceived the elite. But she saw something in him beyond his arrogance, intelligence, resourcefulness, and an understanding of the prison's inner workings. Instead of treating him as an enemy, she approached him with an offer. She had information, connections, and the ability to strategize like no one else. Together, they could change the balance of power. From there, her alliances grew. A former soldier, once loyal to the crown, recognized the fire in her eyes and chose to follow her, teaching her how to fight with precision and discipline. A woman feared for her brutal strength found in the princess a leader worth protecting, someone who saw her as more than just muscle. A scholar imprisoned for treason provided wisdom, offering insights that shaped her vision of control. They were outcasts, criminals, forgotten souls, but under her leadership, they became something greater. She did not demand loyalty through fear like the other prison leaders. Instead, she gave them a cause. The corruption within the prison was undeniable: guards who abused their power, rival factions that thrived on violence, an underground system built on suffering. She promised something different. She would not allow the chaos to rule her world. She would bring order, justice, and a form of leadership that had never existed within these walls. It was not easy. The established powers resisted her, seeking to destroy the unity she was building. They sent threats, orchestrated ambushes, and tried to break her spirit. But with each attack, her alliances only strengthened. She had given people something to fight for, something worth believing in. When the time came to challenge the prison's corrupt rulers, she did not stand alone. She had built an army, not of soldiers, but of survivors, and together, they reshaped the very foundation of the prison's hierarchy. No longer was she just a fallen princess. She was a leader, a symbol of change, and the ruler of a kingdom forged not by birthright, but by sheer will and determination. The alliances she had formed were unexpected, but they had become her greatest weapon. And when the day came for her to leave the prison walls behind, she did not walk out as a prisoner. She walked out as a queen reborn, ready to reclaim the world that had once betrayed her. The world had tried to break her. Stripped of her title, betrayed by those she trusted, and thrown into a prison meant to erase her existence, she had faced suffering beyond anything she had imagined. But instead of letting the darkness consume her, she had used it to forge herself into something new. The once pampered princess had become a warrior, a strategist, a ruler in her own right. And now, it was time for the ultimate comeback. Her escape was not an act of desperation but a carefully orchestrated plan, years in the making. She had spent her time in prison gathering information, learning the schedules of the guards, mapping every hidden passage, every weak point in the fortress that had held her captive. She had built alliances, gained control over the underground prison system, and turned enemies into pawns in her game of survival. Every move she had made had been leading to this moment. The night of the escape was perfect. The warden, corrupt and arrogant, had become comfortable in his power, believing no one could challenge him. But he had underestimated her. Using the connection she had forged, she set chaos in motion, a riot in one wing, a fire in another. While the guards scrambled to restore order, she and her most trusted allies slipped through the shadows, navigating the maze-like corridors with precision. Every step was calculated, every obstacle anticipated. By the time the alarms rang, it was too late. She was already beyond the prison's walls, her enemies left scrambling in her wake. The princess who had been thrown away like a discarded chess piece had outplayed them all. But escape was only the beginning. She had no intention of simply running. She was not the same girl who had been betrayed. She was stronger, sharper, and more powerful than ever before. The world outside had moved on, believing her to be dead, forgotten. But she was far from finished. Using the skills she had learned in prison, she navigated the shadows, gathering resources, finding those still loyal to her cause. She had once relied on her title to command power, but now she understood that true influence came not from privilege, but from knowledge, strength, and the ability to control the game. One by one, she dismantled the forces that had conspired against her. The nobles who had betrayed her, the corrupt officials who had turned a blind eye, none were safe from her calculated vengeance. But she was no longer driven by blind rage. She was smarter now. She struck from the shadows, exposing secrets, turning allies against each other, and reclaiming what had once been stolen from her. By the time she revealed herself to the world, she was not just a survivor, she was a force to be reckoned with. No longer was she the princess who needed saving. She was the queen who had fought her way back, forged in fire, hardened by betrayal, and unshakable in her resolve. She had not only taken back her throne, she had rewritten the rules of power itself. Her enemies had sought to erase her, to strip her of everything she was. But in doing so, they had created something far more dangerous, a ruler who had already endured the worst and emerged victorious. She had made the ultimate comeback, not just to reclaim her place, but to prove that she was stronger than ever before. And this time, no one would dare take her down again.